Welcome. I'm Doug Honig. I'm the Communications Director for the ACLU of Washington. I've met some of you at the kickoff event that was held not too long ago at the Finney Neighborhood Center. I'm very glad to see some of you again. I'm also glad to see many people that I and others of the ACLU haven't met. I'm also glad to see old friends going back to, the late 70s. And somehow Donald Trump seems to bring out a lot of people in the progressive community. Now, the ACLU is very excited by the emergence of people power and the grassroots mobilization that it represents. Nationally and also here in Washington, our membership has tripled since Election Day. Here in Washington on November 8th, we had 25,000 members. Now we have 75,000 members and growing. And to have a grassroots organization that can channel some of the tremendous energy that he whose name will not be mentioned has brought out is really exciting. What we're going to do tonight is let you hear from some of our issue experts about some issues that we've been working on for quite a while that are coming to a head now in terms of votes coming up in King County Council, Seattle City Council, where involvement by people power in terms of supporting them can really make a difference. And these are issues that involve police, and although they're not literally the 9 official policies of the Freedom Cities, they're very much related to it in that they impact immigrant communities and vulnerable communities here in Seattle and in King County, and we want to let you know more about them. We're also going to talk a bit about immigration policies going on and how they impact people in this area. And we will have our Immigration Council talk some about how Seattle and King County stack up against the the so-called ACLU 9 policies. In addition, we don't see ourselves as being just in a defensive posture, although people are most psyched up, understandably, about pushing back and resisting the Trump agenda. We also are very aware that this is a progressive area. It's generally a progressive state, it's a very progressive county, and it's a very progressive city. And we think it's possible at the same time we're resisting Trump, who I guess I have mentioned now, at that same time, we also can make actual advances for civil liberties, and that's part of what we're going to talk about. And we like to think that in some way we can be a beacon for people elsewhere in the country to show that there are positive things that can be done, and it's not all just a matter of stopping Trump initiatives. The specific issues we're going to talk about are police accountability reform here in Seattle, the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance, King County civilian oversight, immigration policies, and also allyship. And allyship means that the ACLU works with many, many, many other organizations. It always depends on the issue. And it's very important to us to be a good partner with other organizations. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, and also a little bit about a few tips on when you go to a city or county council meeting, what are some good ideas of things to do and some not helpful things that you could do. And then at the end, we'll have question and answer. You get to hear more what you'd like to know more about and ask questions from our issue experts. A few things to keep in mind. The ACLU is strictly nonpartisan, and that means not only do we not endorse people in parties, but we never endorse candidates, period. So even in the Seattle mayoral election, which is not a Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, or whatever election, we don't endorse candidates for elective office, nor do we accept money from the government ever as a matter of organizational policy. That one's pretty easy to figure out. Who do we sue? The government. Let's not take money from the people we're going to sue. In addition, we're actually recording it so that people can watch it again, and people who can't come can watch it. So I hope that helps. when you join the ACLU, you join both the ACLU of Washington and the National ACLU. They're actually separate organizations, but we work together very, very closely, and we're all part of the ACLU family. If you're not a member of the ACLU, we'd encourage you to join. It really helps our effectiveness to have more and more people. We also have some information on the back table. Shira, you want to give a wave? And so feel free to take some information afterwards. There's information about some of the issues we're talking about and some of the events that we're going to tell you about that you can attend. There's also a few handouts, including my favorite, the bumper sticker, "No one trumps the Constitution," speaks for itself. Also, if you haven't checked in yet, we would like to know who's been here tonight, and Rachel in the back of the room with the clipboard requests that you stop by and see her if you didn't have a chance to check in at the beginning. Let's see if there's anything else. No, I think that's pretty much it. And I guess the last thing I'd say is that we really look forward to having a collaborative relationship with People Power, because we understand People Power was called into being by the National ACLU, but it's separate own organization. When you have meetings with public officials, you don't speak for the ACLU of Washington, you speak for People Power, but at the same time we want to work collaboratively with you. And actually at the kickoff event, among the working groups that were formed there and that are going on was one entitled Collaboration with the ACLU, and we look forward to going forward with that relation. So our first speaker tonight is going to be Anoka Herat, who is our Immigration Counsel.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us here tonight. It's so exciting to see a full room and learning about these issues. I'm going to speak to you today about some immigration issues. So first, we're going to just go over some basic Immigration 101 so that we can all be on the same page and use some of the same language. Then I'll talk about Trump's executive orders, which I'm sure you're all aware of and been hearing about in the news. Then I'll go into the 9 model policies and where Seattle and King County match up with them. And then we can talk about what you can do. So as you know, the United States is a nation of immigrants. Nearly a quarter of our population is foreign-born or the child of someone who is foreign-born. There's an estimated 40 million people who fit into this category of foreign-born people living in the U.S., and an estimated 29 million of those people have lawful status. So maybe they're here on visas or they have green cards or something like that. And 11 million are deemed undocumented. Now, someone may be undocumented because they entered the country without papers. They entered not at a checkpoint or through an airport. Or they could be undocumented because they did come to the U.S. lawfully. Maybe they were here on a student visa or a tourist visa, but they stayed after that visa expired, and so therefore they're not documented anymore. In Washington, we have a large immigrant population as well, and 39% of those immigrants come from Asia, but the top 3 countries of immigrants are Mexico, the Philippines, and China. So you might ask, why are there 11 million undocumented people in the U.S.? There's lots of reasons why people migrate, and there's pushes and pulls from all different countries. But one of the reasons is in 2013 there was immigration reform, and there was a bill that passed the Senate that would have given many, many, many of these people lawful status here in the U.S. And unfortunately, although it passed by 2/3 of the Senate, it failed in the House, and it didn't ever move forward. And so that really has left to this problem where we have so many people who are undocumented. And there's a common misconception, this idea of, why don't people get in line, or why don't people just apply for status? And actually, you can't really do that. And there are some avenues if you do have U.S. citizen relatives. For example, if you have a U.S. citizen sibling, or your parents are U.S. citizens and you're older, over 21, you could get status that way. But for people from Mexico, getting status through a U.S. family member takes over 20 years often, and so it's really not a practical expectation. And of course, immigration reform would have remedied that, but it failed. And so now what we see is that we have a large group of people within that 11 million who enter the U.S. as children and who have grown up here. And we often think of those people as dreamers. You might have heard that before. And under Obama, there was a program for them to be able to get lawful status, temporary lawful status, called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. We also have a group of people within that 11 million who are in mixed status families. So the parents might have come over and they might have been undocumented, but then they had children here in the U.S. And if you're born in the U.S., you are a U.S. citizen. And so that's sort of the bottom group of people who are U.S. citizens who have undocumented parents. And Obama also tried to get status for them. It was called Deferred Action for Parents of Americans. But unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court found that to be unconstitutional and it wasn't allowed to go forward. So we still have this huge group of people. And Donald Trump has talked about deporting 3 million people of this 11 million. Now, we don't have a national police force, and so what he's relying on is immigration agents, and so the Department of Homeland Security covers immigration, and the two main agencies within DHS that we hear about relating to immigration are ICE, which stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and CBP, Customs and Border Protection. Now, ICE enforces the immigration laws. They're the ones who come and pick people up. They're the ones who do the ICE raids. They investigate immigration status, they apprehend, and they detain people. In Washington State, if you're picked up by ICE, you get detained at the Tacoma Northwest Detention Facility. Also, if you're in Oregon, that's often where you go as well. And CBP manages the border. So they control the ports. They're at the airport. That's who you see at the airport. And they have jurisdiction within 100 miles of the border. And actually, that 100 miles was something that was added to the laws in the 1950s. It was just sort of an arbitrary number. But now, almost 2/3 of the United States population lives within 100 miles of the border. So that includes New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago. And actually, Seattle is like 112 miles or something like that from the border. So we're not, but it covers Shoreline and Everett, and so within that jurisdiction, CBP has the authority to set up checkpoints and search people, and of course in the airports and ports, and so there are 10,000 CBP agents, and Trump wants to increase that number by 5,000. But still, these numbers are not sufficient to deport 3 million people. And so what the Trump administration is doing is they are compelling, and in some cases even coercing, local law enforcement to be the forces and the agents of immigration. And the way they talk about it is they say, local police officers can be a force multiplier. So they can sort of get into communities and help deport 3 million people. These federal agencies wouldn't really be able to do that on their own. And so that's where a lot of the 9 model policies come into play, and some of the things we'll be talking about tonight. So we'll talk about Trump's executive orders. On January 25th, he issued 2 executive orders that directly relate to immigration. The first was public safety in the interior of the U.S., and I'll talk about this in more detail, both of these in more detail. And the main things that did was that created the extremely broad ICE enforcement priorities. It also threatened what's called sanctuary cities, or freedom cities, if you will, or welcoming cities. He also created, the second executive order was the Border Security and Immigration Enforcement Order, also known as the Muslim Ban or the Refugee Ban. Thanks to litigation, including ACLU litigation, that has been stayed. And so that's been put on hold. So the Refugee Ban is not in effect, and it won't be until the courts figure out whether it's constitutional or not. So going back to that first executive order, when he created the ICE enforcement priorities, to give you some background, so we have 11 million people. We don't have the resources. The federal government doesn't have the resources to deport 11 million people, so you have to come up with priorities. Obama said, we're going to prioritize the people with felonies and with 3 or more misdemeanors or with serious misdemeanors. And Trump got rid of that and said, we're going to prioritize everyone. So we're prioritizing 11 million undocumented people. And in some ways, law enforcement are the gatekeepers for this. So any contact with law enforcement, even if it's arrest, even if you're never charged with a crime, you're not found guilty, any contact where they can get your fingerprints goes into a national database, and then ICE can access it. So that's where, so having such high priorities or such broad priorities means that so many people are now are being targeted. There's also been an increase in raids. You might have heard a month or so ago in Los Angeles, there were huge raids and huge protests. And one thing that's been different in Washington State, and what we're seeing here, is that we haven't seen ICE come and round up a lot of people in one go. What we have seen a couple of weeks ago even was ICE picking up 89 people in the Pacific Northwest, but each one of those were at individual homes or in individual workplaces. And so in a sense, it's harder to organize around that, right? So it's been harder to sort of protest at each one of those. But we've been partnering with the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, which is one of the main immigrant advocacy coalitions in Washington that we're partnering with, and they're developing a hotline to try to help have a rapid response to these sort of individual raids, so that we can be quick to respond to that. And I'll give you some more information about that later. We're also seeing that ICE is now coming to what's called sensitive locations. So before, there were places that, not even just under Obama, but even under Bush, were sort of off limits, like the ICE wouldn't come into churches or funerals or schools, and even courthouses, they wouldn't come in. But now we're seeing that ICE is coming into courthouses, and they're picking up people who are going to court to report DV, domestic violence. And so they picked up someone in Texas who went to court to seek a protection order against her abusive ex-husband, and she was picked up by ICE and put into detention proceedings. So that has a huge chilling effect, as you can imagine. People don't want to show up to court. They don't want to testify as witnesses because they're afraid they're going to get picked up by ICE. And so far in Washington, again, we haven't heard of this happening yet in Washington, but ICE has said, and Attorney General Jeff Sessions has said, well, actually, it's better for our agents to come to courthouses because it's safer for ICE agents because then people have gone through security. They've gone through metal detectors. So it's safer for our ICE agents to go to courthouses. So that's why we have a preference for that. So that's really concerning, and it's something that we're definitely watching. The other thing is we're seeing an increase in the use of ICE detainers. And an ICE detainer is a request that ICE puts to local law enforcement that says, after this person, this non-citizen, serves their time in jail, hold them for an additional 48 hours so that we can come and investigate it further and pick them up and send them to Tacoma if we decide to. Now, in 2014, a federal court found these ICE detainers, which Obama was using as well, and they've been in use for a long time. They found them to be unconstitutional. And they said, you can't, it's a Fourth Amendment violation. You can't just hold someone without probable cause that they've committed a crime. And actually being undocumented isn't a crime. And so you can't do that, and there's no probable cause, and there's no order from a judge, so that's unconstitutional. And since 2014, the vast majority of Washington counties don't hold people for ICE. But now, under Trump, they issued new ICE detainers earlier this month, and they're going back to the same language of detain people for 48 hours. So the other thing that executive order did was they threatened sanctuary cities or welcoming cities or freedom cities. And what they said was any jurisdiction that refuses to cooperate with ICE, we're gonna pull federal funding. And you're in violation of federal law. We know that that's actually not true. We know that that's not true. Because, as I said before, it's found unconstitutional to comply with some of these things that they're asking of local law enforcement. These policies do not violate federal law, and there have been a number of lawsuits challenging that assertion and trying to sort of call the bluff of the Trump administration. Seattle filed a lawsuit, San Francisco, and a number of others. Jeff Sessions, Attorney General Sessions, has said we're going to claw back federal funding, and again, that's unconstitutional, and it kind of goes back to the structure of the federal government versus the state government. The federal government isn't allowed to tell state institutions, oh, you go do the work of the federal government. That's unless, of course, they pay for it. But the federal government isn't paying local police to act as immigration enforcement officials, and so they cannot commandeer the states to do that. And over here, this is an example. This is the Seattle City Council, and they passed a welcoming resolution. And one thing that these resolutions have in common is that they all have a commitment to inclusion. And many of them will refuse to allow local law enforcement to partner with ICE to enforce immigration policies. and they would only honor these ICE detainers if they came with a federal criminal warrant approved by a judge. And so far, there's at least 23 jurisdictions, although we know that others as well have similar policies and practices. And so again, this is the second executive order, and that one is stayed. And this is an image from one of our partner organizations, EFF. I did not consent to the search of this device. In 2015, CBP searched 5,000 laptops and cell phones at the border. In February alone, under the Trump administration, CBP searched 5,000 laptops and devices. And they've been searching laptops and cell phones of citizens as well as people who are not citizens. So this is deeply concerning. They say that they have a lot of discretion, which is true, at the border, but there's, as you all know, there's a big difference between searching your cell phone and searching a piece of luggage. Your cell phone really unlocks intimate details about your personal life, and so this is something that's very concerning to us and that we're keeping an eye on. And we're also seeing that there has been an increase in the surveillance of Muslims entering the U.S. Now I'll talk about I think we're going to do questions at the end. But yeah, if you can hold it, remember it. I'll talk about the freedom cities and the 9 model policies as they relate to Seattle and King County. So I wanted to just pull out these 5, the judicial warrant rule, the no facilitation rule, the don't ask rule, redress rule, and the fair and partial policing rule. Now, all of these relate to the ability of local law enforcement to partner with ICE. And we should be really proud here in Seattle and King County because we have really nailed it. I mean, these are places where the judicial warrant rule, for example, the King County Ordinance, which has been in effect for a few years now, said since 2014, we will not honor ICE detainers unless there's a federal judicial warrant, which is very rare. And that has been a model that has been used across the country as a template for other jurisdictions. So we should be really proud that our city and our county has made a commitment to these kinds of, to not partnering with federal immigration in these ways. These two others of the 9 model policies, the clear identification rule, that's basically saying, are you wearing something that says you're ICE or CBP? And then the privacy protection rule, that relates to a local jail or King County jail notifying ICE when they have someone who's a non-citizen whom is undocumented. And actually, we don't have anything in writing, but in King County and in Seattle, we have really good practices around this. And we haven't heard from any of our partners on the ground or any impacted people that these have been an issue. So these are places where Seattle and King County have great practices. Now, number 3 is defined access and interview rule. That relates to jails and whether when ICE comes into a jail, the jail will allow ICE to have access to and interview undocumented people in the jail to sort of investigate immigration, their immigration status and their immigration history. We've reached out to some of our colleagues and partners and allies working on jail practices, and they said, hold on. This is a great question and this is a great issue to explore, but there are other issues that they also want to explore. So if you do meet with someone in jail, they said to hold off because they have other questions to ask to try and push these things in the right places. And so once we get those, their additional asks for jails in particular, we will put that through People Power and let you guys know as soon as we hear about those things. So if you do go and meet with a jail, you can ask a broader range of questions. The next thing is the last of the 9 model policies is number 7, the discriminatory surveillance prohibition rule. And Shankar came, perfect timing. He'll be talking to you a little bit later in the presentation about surveillance and the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance, which is an opportunity for, and again, a place where we should be really proud that our city is taking proactive measures to curtail the kind of surveillance that is really concerning to us so that we can monitor and have some transparency and accountability for the surveillance programs. So in addition to what Shankar will tell you, these are some other things that you can do. As I mentioned, there is this ICE rapid response hotline that's getting up and running, and there is a handout in the back. If you want to volunteer, they're having their orientation on April 27th. There is a strong preference for Spanish speakers. So if you or anyone you know is Spanish speaking and would like to volunteer, this is a great way to just plug in and be able to help everyone. If there is a raid in progress, we can sort of call in the forces and organize and mobilize to help people not get picked up by ICE. The other thing is on May 1st at 11 a.m., there's a March for Immigrant Rights. I think there's going to be a really big protest, and it is so important to show up and to keep showing up at these protests. They are making such a huge difference. You know they're getting under Trump's skin, and they're getting the press and media, and that's what influences policy. And it shows our lawmakers that these things matter and that we're watching. The other thing you can do is call your member of Congress and ask them to support. There are 2 bills in the U.S. Congress right now. One is protecting sensitive locations. As I mentioned before, this would codify these practices of not entering places like churches or any sort of religious facility, or schools or funeral homes or even courthouses, and prevent ICE from going there and picking people up. And the second one is, it doesn't have a number yet, but it's called Protecting Data of the Border Act, and that addresses that search and surveillance of our laptops and cell phones. And what it would require is it would require CBP to get a search warrant before they looked at our devices, which is what the police would have to do also. So both these things are really great to support, and we should let our members of Congress know that we are expecting them to protect all of our civil liberties in this way. So that's it from me, and I'll pass it along to Michelle. Thank you guys so much.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Storms. I'm the Deputy Director at the ACLU of Washington. I've been there since September, about 6 weeks after I started. Our world got a little bit rocked when the elections took place, and so it's been an exciting place to work, by all means. I'm going to... I know that what Anoka shared with you is really central to the ask that you got from National with regard to the model policies and the freedom cities, and that work is so important. And as you can see, some of those things in this community, we're doing a fantastic job. Some of them, there's still work that needs to be done. In some, we have allies on the ground who've been working these issues for a really long time. But I think that the other thing that we really wanted to share with you this evening is some of the other things that are going on that are related, that are critical, and that we feel like if you were willing to put some of your activism toward those issues as well, it would be really beneficial for our community. So on the sort of police front, it's me. On the police front, in addition to hearing about some of the issues that Anoka has shared with you about the way in which the federal government wants to use our law enforcement as an arm of the federal government, which is inappropriate, and then later also Shankar is going to be sharing with you about a local surveillance ordinance which relates to some of these issues as well. I wanted to tell you about some of the work we've been doing for a long time related to police practices in general. So there are 3 particular challenges that I would identify apart from other things that others are going to share with you tonight. It is the deadly use of force, it is racially biased policing, and it is the need for civilian or community oversight and accountability of law enforcement. Those are 3 issues that the ACLU of Washington has been working on for quite some time and made a lot of progress, but there are still things yet to be done. So here in Seattle, there had been a number of incidents of excessive force that you heard about in the news, but I think things really came to a head with the heartbreaking shooting death of John T. Williams, a Native American carver who was hard of hearing. The police officer was asking him to put his carving knife down. He didn't put it down, probably because he didn't hear him, and then he was shot and killed. And that just seemed to be really a culmination of so many horrible events that had taken place. And the ACLU joined with 34 community organizations. So this is another example of the way in which our work is most successful because we're able to work with others. We joined with 34 other organizations, and we wrote to the Department of Justice and said, come in here and have a look at our Seattle Police Department, something is terribly wrong. And we specifically raised those issues of deadly use of force and racially biased policing. So what happened was a 9-month investigation ensued of the Seattle Police Department. There was a finding of a pattern or practice of excessive force violating the U.S. Constitution and federal law, and the investigation also raised serious concerns about racially biased policing. Now, the city of Seattle initially did not agree with those findings, but felt that it was probably in their best interest to go ahead and enter into the consent decree. So that happened in 2012. And so under the consent decree, a couple of important things happened. There was a monitor, an individual identified who would, watch the progress of the work. There was a charge to create the Community Police Commission. This is actually something that we're really very proud of, because it was a body to be community oversight of law enforcement. And then also, of course, the consent decree was wanting the police department to look at its practices around force and to look at where bias was playing into policing. So the Community Police Commission, which those are pretty much most of the members of that group, really has been put together, meant to be very diverse in all possible ways in terms of where people live across the city, in terms of their relationship to ethnic and racial groups and different segments of work within the community, and that these folks would take a look at the police department and assist them with looking at their use of force policies and looking at what are ways for deeper trust to be in place between law enforcement and the community, as well as looking at practices they have that might help them to be more aware of the ways in which, for example, implicit bias impacts police and the things that they do. So, as I mentioned, that consent decree was entered into in 2012, and it's now 5 years later. A lot of pretty great things have happened. They've really been analyzing where their use of force is. They've been analyzing, looking at data on who they're picking up, actually beginning to track racial information and to sort of see, be able to do a bit of a scientific study, right, on who they're stopping and what they're doing. So those are really good things. Now, one of the things about the Community Police Commission, which we feel is an absolutely central aspect of this work, in improving both community relations with police and, frankly, improving the effectiveness of police, is that this body was intended to sunset once completion or once the consent decree ended. And we feel like that's a really bad idea, and the community feels that way as well. And so right now, there is an ordinance before the City Council that would do several things. One, it would make the Community Police Commission permanent. Two, it would change some of the ways in which it operates so that it's absolutely politically independent. So originally, a lot of those, the director was appointed by the mayor, and there was a lot of close relationship with city operation in terms of evaluation and appointment and selection of members and so forth. So one of the other changes they want to make, is for the body to be far more independent. And as you can imagine, for community trust to really be enhanced, to know that these are not mayoral or city council appointees. These are folks who have an independent budget, an independent system of evaluation, is really powerful. So that's something else that this ordinance would do. Another thing that it will do is create an Office of the Inspector General, which is going to be a new body that will be the body that's doing the primary, be a civilian individual, so not a law enforcement person, who is going to handle those investigations of police misconduct and address complaints that come through to the police force. This is so important. I cannot emphasize enough what a sea change it represents to have these things in place, and this is what we're up against now. So the ACLU of Washington has really long advocated for the importance of civilian oversight, And there have been a number of hearings so far, and there are going to be a lot more. I actually spoke with the director of the Community Police Commission earlier today, and I don't have a date for you on when the City Council's actually going to take a vote, but the Community Police Commission is holding a couple of public meetings coming up, and I don't have the specific information for you now, so I'm hoping I can send that to you later. They're going to hold some meetings to help the public understand what's at stake with the ordinance, and to understand how you can most be helpful. And so I wanted to be able to give you that information this evening. It wasn't quite ready for me to do so, but I'm hoping that I can provide that shortly. I know there will be 2 different public meetings, same purpose for both of the meetings, right? So if you can't get to one, you can go to the other. So that's coming up, and that's important. So the other thing I wanted to talk about besides the Seattle issue is King County. So there's our King County Council. I actually went and testified to them today about this issue that I'm going to describe, but there's still more to be done on this one as well. So back in 2006, ACLU of Washington participated in a King County Sheriff Blue Ribbon panel to look at issues with the Sheriff's Department and how it was going. And so the report that came out of that panel identified some really significant concerns about the ways in which complaints were handled, how investigations were handled, oversight. And so for one of the recommendations that came out of that panel was that King County have a civilian oversight body. And so the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight, OLEO, was formed at that time, and it's gone through a couple of directors. They have a wonderful director now named Deborah Jacobs, who interestingly not only worked long ago at the ACLU of Washington, but she is a former executive director of the ACLU in New Jersey, the affiliate over there. So you can imagine that she has a viewpoint of civilian oversight that is really connected to civil rights and civil liberties, and it's pretty exciting to have a person like that working with the sheriff's office. So the original ordinance that created OLEO was great. It created the office, but it didn't really give it the kind of power that it needed to actually independently investigate complaints and concerns with the sheriff's office. It was limited in how many records it could see. It was limited in the types of actions it could take. So under the new director's leadership, a new ordinance has been drafted that will actually give the strength that's needed to OLEO so that it can really be a meaningful oversight body. So that was what I got to go and testify about today. And it's kind of neat because, you know, one of the things that we have, I think many of you know about this with the ACLU is action alerts. You can sign up for action alerts. So we did an action alert about the hearing today, and a couple of people came because in response to the action alert and also testified in favor of this ordinance. The ordinance was not resolved today. There will be additional work because there's another angle, which is the collective bargaining of people in the Sheriff's Department, and so there will be another opportunity to come back after whatever they do to it and have the council resolve that. So that will be another thing that we will get back to you about when that time comes, because we'll really need to come out strong in support of, again, that full independence and that power to genuinely investigate and hold law enforcement accountable. So if you haven't already signed up for our action alerts, I so strongly encourage it, because all of these hearings, both with the Seattle City Council, the things that Shankar is going to talk to you about as well, when we send those out, we not only tell you when and where the opportunity is for you to be engaged, but we usually have some talking points or some background information for you. So that's all I was going to share with you about these issues for now, and I hope that that's helpful, and I hope it's something that you would feel motivated to be involved in, because this is, you know, that ability. I mean, you know, nationwide, our community relationship with law enforcement has just been getting worse and worse, and under the current administration, where the talk has been very pro-strong law enforcement and, well, some of you are shaking your head, so you get it. It's going to be very, very important that we keep in mind that community policing really does make a positive difference. Trust between community and law enforcement means that we're all safer. So those are my comments for now, and I'll be here for when questions come later.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shankar Narayan. I am the Technology and Liberty Project Director at the ACLU of Washington. Prior to that, I used to be the Legislative Director. I switched over about mid-year last year, and I'm coming up on 9 years at the ACLU, which is a little crazy to think about. So I came at the very tail end of the second Bush administration. I saw the whole Obama administration, and now we're seeing Trump. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But, I'll start here by saying that on surveillance, unlike perhaps on police accountability and some of the other issues that have been talked about, there's a lot less visibility both of what is actually happening with government agencies and what folks can do about it. So in my remarks, I'm not going to assume that you guys know what's happening with Seattle Police Department, for example, around local surveillance. I'm going to try to put some of those building blocks in place about how we think about surveillance, why we think it's important, why the Trump administration really changes the game around surveillance, and then to engage you in a very specific ask, which is to support the changes to the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance that we are supporting, where we really could use a lot of help and some public transparency. And I'll flag a couple of future asks as well, but for now, the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance is really where the action is locally. So I work on freedom from intrusive government surveillance, right? I'm going to put a few premises on the table for you in terms of how we think about this. Premise number one is that we think you shouldn't actually have to choose between public safety and your constitutional rights. Imagine that, right? That you could both have constitutional rights and public safety. But they're often presented, I think, as this false dichotomy where if law enforcement wants a particular tool, they say, well, we need this for public safety, and therefore civil liberties have to be degraded. Not necessarily the case, right? If we are smart about our use of surveillance technologies and put the right sideboards around them to make sure they're not abused, as well as the right systems around them to make sure they're not abused, we have a much better chance than if we simply allow law enforcement to purchase tools, as is happening now, without any safeguards or transparency whatsoever. We also don't think that by saying something is an issue of terrorism or national security that it should operate above the checks and balances of our Constitution, right? Simple. We also think that people actually still care about their privacy, right? It's not necessarily that people don't care if they're being surveilled or not. I think a lot of folks have actually, they actually do care a lot, and we know this through both polling and from individual conversations we have with folks. It's often that they just don't know what to do about it, and so a lot of them kind of throw up their hands and say, well, we can't really win this fight, so we're not gonna engage. Premise number 4, indiscriminate surveillance has a cost, right? And it's not just a dollar cost. That is particularly important because we now see the federal government either subsidizing or providing for free these surveillance tools. Vendors aggressively market them. You may have seen, for example, Taser just offered free body cameras for a year to every police department in the United States, right? So they're trying to take the dollar cost out of the equation. What we would say is you still have to consider the other costs, right? What about the cost of surveillance on people's willingness to, say, go to a protest or to go to and from their place of worship, right? Are they more or less likely to talk to a law enforcement officer if that officer is wearing a body camera and they know that footage could be used against them to prosecute them? A lot of questions that never get asked around many of the ways that we adopt surveillance technology right now. Finally, premise number 5 is technology changes the game, right? So we've had surveillance, we've had government tracking activists for a very long time. They always seem to want to do it. The question is, why is it different now? And the answer to that is because there's much more information sharing, and surveillance has become cheaper and easier to implement on a massive scale, less detectable, and that information no longer stays locked in someone's file cabinet in a corner of one police agency. It effectively, if it's collected locally, can go to the federal government. It can be used for purposes far beyond what it was originally intended for. So that's why I think the stakes have really gone up around surveillance locally. And of course, now we leave this trail of digital debris everywhere we go, right? I bet most of the people in this room are carrying cell phones, but it's also using apps. It's also driving your car, which is smarter than it used to be. It's the applications in your home. It's your video alarm system. It's logging onto websites on the internet. Now what we have is the ability to both aggregate that data and analyze it to draw connections and draw out information about a particular individual that we would not have been able to do before, right? So there's lots and lots of fine-grained data. That is being aggregated by data brokers. It can be sold back to the government as well. And this can happen even when you've taken affirmative steps to keep that data private. So it's really going around the privacy protections that you've tried to put around your data in ways that you may never become aware of. So let's take this to the local level and talk about what's happened in the last few years with one agency, Seattle Police Department. Some of you may be aware, some of you may not, but in the last few years, SPD has acquired drones. They have acquired or are in the process of acquiring video and audio-based gunshot locator technologies. They are rolling out police body cameras, although with some bumps in the road. They have facial recognition, and they have social media monitoring systems. Most, if not all of those, were acquired, with the exception of body cameras, which has its own sort of history. But most of them were really acquired without any public debate whatsoever as to whether, A, they actually worked for the purpose that they were being articulated around. Actually, in most of them, no purpose was ever articulated at all, right? No one actually asked question one, which is, what is this thing for, right? What is it going to do? In the case of drones, they simply bought 2 of them, and they said, well, we'll figure out what to do with them after we fly them around. And the response, for the most part, when people ask them, what are you going to do with them, is, well, we'll tell you after a year, after we've had a year to play with them and figure out what they're good for. Not the right way to acquire technology, right? The first thing to do is articulate a purpose for the technology. The second thing to do is ask whether your tool is actually good to achieve that purpose, and does the data actually support that, right? Do you have any evidence that it's good for that? And then you start talking about the costs and benefits, right? So even if it actually achieves the purpose, is it a worthwhile investment, right? Do we need for people in Seattle Police Department reviewing body camera footage for public disclosure purposes? And they do have 4 people now whose entire job is that. Or would we have been better off with 4 community liaisons to improve community police relations, right? That question never got asked. And then on top of that, of course, there needs to be some kind of an opportunity for public debate around whether the use of this tool actually comports with our values, and if so, what sideboards do we want in terms of what is an acceptable use for this tool and what is not. I'm going to give you one very specific example that hit the headlines a couple of months ago. This is social media monitoring systems. So these are very powerful systems. They're basically tools that suck up massive amounts of social media posts, and they can do a real deep dive into those social media posts, figure out where they're coming from, figure out who they're associated with, and again, paint a fairly clear picture of their targets. These tools have been used elsewhere. For example, in Baltimore, they were used in the protests, to surveil the protesters after Freddie Gray was killed by police there. They have been used to track the Black Lives Matter movement. In some instances, these tools actually assign people a threat score, right? You never get to know why the threat score was assigned, but suddenly this person has a red alert associated with them that a law enforcement officer may actually know before he comes into or she comes into contact with that individual, and that may unnecessarily escalate the interaction, right? Seattle Police Department acquired a flavor of this tool, SMMS, called Geofeedia. That was done without any public input, again, without an articulation of purpose. They used it for a few months. They've now switched over to a different tool called Babel Street. And yet we still have yet to have the public debate about what the purpose of this tool actually is. Is Seattle Police Department planning to use it in high-profile events, like, you know, a foreign leader coming to Seattle, you know, around Seahawks games, right? There may be some acceptable uses with tight sideboards. On the other hand, right, if they're geofencing a mosque or if they're surveilling protesters, the chilling factor goes up quite a lot. Right now, we have no idea what they're doing, right? And there's really no transparency mechanism to get them to tell us what they are doing. And once again, this stuff also gets archived, right? And so you can imagine a situation where the federal government comes knocking on the door asking for information about particular people. And of course, social media posts may be able to reveal if someone is undocumented or not. There are also other databases that our local governments have that may be able to reveal that. And we cannot really keep that information from the federal government once it's collected and stored at the local level. So that is also a concern. What would we like to do about this? Well, the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance was actually passed in 2013. We pushed for this bill, which is basically a transparency mechanism that requires every piece of surveillance equipment that the city acquires, any department, not just Seattle Police Department, to actually go through a public process and to be approved by the city council. In the years since then, it's actually become clear that, one thing that's become clear is that SPD and other agencies do not like daylight around their acquisition of surveillance technologies, because nobody has actually put a single piece of technology through this public process. And yet we know so many of them have been acquired. How is that possible? It's possible because they are interpreting, loopholes in the language that was not tightly enough written to say, oh, well, we would only use this tool in an exigent circumstance, for example, in an emergency. Therefore, we're going to put our entire acquisition as being under an emergency situation and not run it through the public process. That exception was really only intended for situations where someone's life and limb was in danger, right? So we are trying to tighten up the language. We want to make sure that it fits how technology is acquired today. We want to make sure that whether Seattle's operating the technology or they're contracting with somebody else to acquire the technology or operate the technology and just buying the data, or they're giving surveillance data out to other agencies, we want that all to be covered by the surveillance ordinance so that we at least have a chance to know how these tools are being used. And then after that, it's really up to all of you, right? I think once we get that process in place, then every single piece of technology that's a surveillance technology will have to go to a public process where if our city council hears from you all that that tool is not in line with our values or needs strong sideboards around it, they will listen. They do respond to constituent pressure. The ordinance just had its first hearing in Lorena Gonzalez's Gender Equity and New Americans Committee, and it will have at least two more in that committee, two more hearings and opportunities for public input. So those will both be opportunities for folks to come, pack the room, use the public comment period to talk about how important it is to strengthen the ordinance. One thing that happened from our first draft was that almost all of the public testimony and public meeting requirements were stripped out of the ordinance, right? That's the one thing that law enforcement chose to target. We need to get that stuff back in, and we need your help to do that. So come and testify. We'll let you know when those meetings are scheduled. And then, of course, there'll be a hearing and a vote in the full council, and we would love to pack the room and show support for the ordinance at that time. Many other interesting things will be happening, so I'll close by saying there will be, one thing that is on the horizon is an update to the Seattle Intelligence Ordinance, which is really about protecting First Amendment activities, but has not been updated since the late 70s or early 80s, and really needs a refresh to reflect the way that intelligence is collected now. There's also bills on the state level. For example, right now there's a bill around protecting broadband privacy after many of you probably heard the FCC's rules that were about to go into effect that would prevent broadband providers from selling your information off to the highest bidder were repealed. So they're trying to fix that on the state level, and we're in support of that effort. And then eventually, actually, we would like basically a protection at the state level that prevents government agencies from collecting information on people's First Amendment activities, like protest, like religious exercise, without suspecting them of a crime. So that's sort of more big picture ambitious. We've got a lot of things in the works. We want to start with the Surveillance Ordinance, and we would love your help. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Laisel Tomas-Rabujio, and I'm the field director. And similar to Shankar, I've been here for almost 9 years. And my primary responsibility is working with other organizations, with our allies. So tonight, I'll be talking to you about the importance of allyship. As you heard from Michelle, Inoka, and Shankar, we don't do this work alone. So it's important for us to work with other organizations and community leaders that have a shared interest and shared goals. Sometimes the ACLU is the only organization that works on a particular issue, but oftentimes we aren't. And being such a large and well-known organization, we have to be mindful about entering into organizing and advocacy spaces, particularly when there are smaller organizations that might view us as the 800-pound gorilla, even though we have really good relationships with many, many organizations across the state. And we also have to be mindful of what kind of footprint we're leaving when we enter into coalitions or networks where we're not the only ones doing that work. And in all of our working relationships, we have to be respectful and acknowledge the work of our allies in order to be effective. So I wanted to give you some examples of how at the ACLU we work in allyship. One area is police accountability in Pasco. When Antonio Zambrano Montes was killed by Pasco police officers in 2015, we knew immediately we had to act. But because we aren't in Pasco, even though we're a statewide organization, it's easy for locals to view us as the outsiders. So we knew we also had to be very careful how we entered that space and how we presented ourselves and how we worked with the local advocates. So we learned that there was going to be a rally in Pasco just a few days after the shooting. And so we reached out to the community contacts that we knew in the Tri-Cities, and we took a couple carloads full of ACLU staff. We asked the organizers how they thought it would be helpful for us to participate. So that's another important thing, is to, before entering a space, if you can find some of the local leaders, ask them how would it be helpful for us to show up in this space. And while we were there, we met other advocates, and subsequently maintained a relationship and built trust through meetings, phone call meetings, and also going to Pasco on a regular basis. And so while the ACLU has deep expertise in police accountability, in Pasco, we don't present ourselves as the leaders of the organizing and the advocacy that's going on there. We work really closely with the leaders in Pasco, and even though we may not agree on every single point or come down to the same analysis, we always keep them up to speed on what we're doing. And if it makes strategic sense, we do meetings together with local electeds, we do press conferences together, and before we take on a big action, whether it's sending a letter to the police chief or holding a press conference, we always let them know what's going on so that they hear about it from us instead of learning it from someone else, or especially learning about what we're doing through the media. And sometimes they may ask us, our allies in Pasco, may ask us to take certain actions or to use certain messaging, and sometimes we have to say no. And because we've built that trust and have that mutual respect in that relationship, they understand when we have to say no, and they know that we want to be helpful and effective and not just throw our weight around. Another example of how we work in allyship is how we plan on participating in the upcoming May Day March that Inoka mentioned. It's organized by an organization called El Comité and other immigrant rights groups, and we're being supportive by mobilizing our supporters to march with us, but we're also taking the lead from the organizers by using the messaging that they want and by using images that they want, because one of the themes of the march is going to be the resistance is unified, and we certainly want to help promote that in the signs and the slogans that we use. And being a good ally means that we understand that this isn't our march, and we're not going to take credit for all of the work that's been going on in making this march happen. And we're also supporting their work because it's largely connected to the work that we're doing that everyone here has already described. So now I just want to highlight the article that was passed out on how to be a good ally. And when you go home tonight, I really encourage you to read that thoroughly. But at this point, I do want to lift up point number 7, how allies don't need to be in the spotlight. So at the ACLU, it's really easy for us to get media attention and the credit because we're such a large organization. We've been here for a long time, and we're well known. But we don't have to be in the spotlight all the time. First of all, we're not always the best messenger. And if we're always the ones to be out in the front, carrying the flag, whatever flag that is, because we're the ACLU, sometimes that may fall on deaf ears. And also, when it makes sense, when it makes strategic sense, we try to reflect attention from ourselves to our allies who are doing the work. For example, in one of the campaigns we're working on, when we get media calls, when it makes sense, we refer media to some of our allies so that they can be interviewed instead of the ACLU always being quoted all the time. And actually, one time we were approached by an ACLU supporter who wanted to do a fundraiser because she cared about a particular issue. And it happened to be an issue that we weren't doing a lot of work on, but one of our allies was more heavily involved. So we redirected that supporter to this ally because, one, we weren't really doing much on that issue, and also we didn't want to take the credit for doing work that we weren't doing. And then also it promotes, good stewardship to our allies. And I think that example also acknowledges the work that organizations and community groups are already doing. And when that acknowledgement happens, it helps build trust and broadens our support and also deepens our impact. And this sounds really cliche, but we are stronger when we work together. And it's not to endorse a particular candidate who used that theme, but really, we are stronger when we're together. And the last thing I'll mention on how to be a good ally is how we show up at city council meetings, because there's a lot of opportunity here in Seattle to go to King County council meetings or city council meetings. So when at a city council meeting, it's important to remember the goal, and that's to support legislation or maybe oppose it, depending on what the issue is. And I wanted to offer a few suggestions on how to be the most effective at council hearings. The first is to be respectful to council members, so not interrupting or yelling at council members, because when that happens, that may actually be in opposition to allies' strategies, and it can inadvertently take the spotlight away from the issue or other voices. You can show your support with signs, wearing big buttons, by applauding when you hear someone provide testimony that really resonates with you. And finally, I would also recommend not attacking council members. Again, to be respectful, even if you don't agree with their positions, because the council member may not agree with you on one issue, but may be with you on another. And so it's important to have that positive relationship, even if there's disagreement with the council member, because when they see that you are someone that can work through disagreement, that'll make you more effective. That's all I have for tonight, and I look forward to hearing questions. Thank you.